Hello, post-Christmasing beautiful community. Bush-Putin transcripts are out, and they've caused a bit of a kerfuffle with the message going viral that what we've needed to understand for ages is that Putin was not invading Ukraine because he was opposed to NATO expansion, but he was opposed to NATO expansion because he wanted to invade Ukraine. We're going to take a look at the transcripts and we'll analyze what can and can't be taken away from them. And we'll do this both via putting us through a little bit of a kind of epistemic analytical exercise. And I don't do this often, but I'm going to put some things on the screen just to help us think together more clearly. But as well as doing that, which helps us feel less lost in this algorithm-defined information environment, we'll also, via the transcripts, ask questions like, when did Putin decide to invade Ukraine? What's Putin's actual position on the expansion of NATO and so on? And I'll give you a better quality version of the sort of discussion you're coming across at the moment in the papers and on YouTube, because I'll talk you through not just how to epistemically view the transcripts, but actually how to think about Putin's evolution in terms of the way Ukraine comes into his thinking over the course of a quarter century. Ready to rock and roll? Okay. We are in 2001. Putin says, what really happened? Soviet goodwill changed the world voluntarily, and Russians gave up thousands of square kilometers of territory voluntarily. Unheard of. Ukraine, part of Russia for centuries, given away. Kazakhstan, given away. The Caucasus, too. Hard to imagine and done by party bosses. Russia, we're still in 2001, beautiful community, is European and multi-ethnic like the United States. I can imagine us becoming allies, Putin said. In 1954, the Soviet Union applied to join NATO. I have the document. NATO gave a negative answer for 4 specific reasons: lack of an Austrian settlement, lack of a German settlement, a totalitarian grip over Eastern Europe, and the need for Russia to cooperate with the UN disarmament process. Now, all these conditions have been met. Perhaps Russia could be an ally. We're in 2008 now. 17 million Russians live in Ukraine, a third of the population. Ukraine, and I'm not going to fact check what Putin says, we'll just take it and we'll react. Ukraine is a very complex state. This is not a nation built in a natural manner. It's an artificial country created back in Soviet times. Following World War II, Ukraine obtained territory from Poland, Romania, Hungary. That's pretty much all of Western Ukraine. In the 20s and the 30s, Ukraine obtained territory from Russia. That's the eastern part of the country. In 56, the Crimean Peninsula was transferred to Ukraine. It's a rather large country, large European country, built with a population of 45 million. It's populated by people with very different mindsets. If you go to Western Ukraine, you'll see villages where the only spoken language is Hungarian and people wear those bonnets. In the East, people are wearing suits, ties, and big hats. NATO is perceived by a large part of the Ukrainian population as a hostile organization. This creates the following problem for Russia. This creates the threat of military bases and new military systems being deployed in the proximity of Russia. It creates uncertainties and threats for us. And relying on the anti-NATO forces in Ukraine, Russia would be working on stripping NATO of the possibility of enlarging. Russia would be creating problems there all the time. What for? What is the meaning of Ukrainian membership in NATO? What benefit is there for NATO and the US? There can be only one reason for it, and that would be to cement Ukraine's status as in the Western world, and that would be the logic. I don't think it's the right logic. I'm trying to comprehend, and given the divergent views of areas of the population on NATO membership, the country could just split apart. I always said there is a certain pro-Western part and a certain pro-Russia part. So this broke out on social media with a lot of tweets going viral, and we'll analyze them both for substance, and because this is not historical substance, this evolution matters now, because it matters for what will happen after the war stops. Is Putin going to invade again? Right? Understanding this isn't just history. but we'll also do a little bit of an analytical workshopping for ourselves of this. Now, here is Yaroslav Trofimov of Wall Street Journal, and here's what he said. The inevitable conclusion from the released Putin-Bush transcripts is Putin didn't invade Ukraine because he opposed NATO enlargement. Putin opposed NATO enlargement because it would have prevented his goal of invading and eliminating Ukraine. The ideas he had a quarter century ago, that Ukraine and Kazakhstan are artificial countries that were given away by Russia and therefore must return, are the ideas he still holds today. Konstantin Sonin. Putin didn't invade Ukraine because of Russia enlargement. Or NATO enlargement, I beg your pardon. He opposed NATO enlargement because he planned to invade Ukraine. And then, just to give you an illustration of how many people are saying this, Zhenya Albats, the Russian journalist commentator, was a good friend of Mr. Navalny, also says exactly right. Now, what Yaroslav says there isn't derivable from the transcripts. Putin opposed NATO enlargement because it would have prevented his goal of invading and eliminating Ukraine. Putin's been opposed to NATO enlargement from the beginning. The question arises, at what point did Putin get it into his head that he wanted to invade Ukraine? Was it in 2022, 2021, 2014, 2004? Was it when Putin was a teenager and he knew the Soviet Union would break up and then he'd be president and invade Ukraine? When did this happen? Now, of the YouTube content creators you watch, only Anders Pack Nielsen would be qualified to have a pop at that question, but it's a very important question. Now, something else Yaroslav says is that these are artificial countries in Putin's view, and that therefore they must be returned. But there is no mention of the return of these countries in the transcripts. Putin might or might not have thought that, but there's no mention of that there. He's not saying, I'm going to return these countries, in particular, return them by military force. So, why are academics and journalists saying this? Because all we get from the transcripts is that Putin has, in 2001 already, and more so in 2008, the imperialist position that says that he doesn't recognize Ukrainian sovereignty. So what we need to do, if we're going to be analytically careful, is reconstruct gradations of commitment to the invasion of Ukraine. Let's do this right now. So one kind of commitment is a fixed invasion intent. Putin already decided that Ukraine must be conquered by force in 2001 and 2008 when these transcripts are being captured. That would have the following implication for the NATO point. NATO expansion threatened the execution of a settled goal, right? Now, we could make that case interpretively, that Putin was already wanting to invade Ukraine in 2000, and we'll come to that in a moment, but we can't make it factually on the basis of the transcript. That's just not there. Let's weaken ourselves now. Conditional invasion intent. Putin already envisaged a full military takeover as a concrete goal. He expected invasion to become necessary if conditions moved against him. So this is a conditional commitment to invasion. NATO expansion threatened the execution of a conditional goal, is what we would say about NATO expansion in that scenario. Now, there is no factual indication of that if we look at the transcripts. That doesn't mean that it wasn't what Putin was thinking. We'll come to that in a moment. But it's certainly not derivable from the transcripts. We can't say the transcripts tell us that. We could say our interpretation of Putin tells us that potentially, but we can't say the transcripts tell us this. Number 3, yet weaker, option holding intent. Putin consciously preserved invasion as a possible instrument. NATO expansion would remove that option. Let's go on. Get even weaker. Subordination without war intent. Putin assumed Ukraine could be controlled without large-scale war. An invasion was not a live option in his thinking. So here we would say NATO expansion threatened influence, not military plans. Is that in the transcripts? I think that it's an interpretive question, whether it is or it isn't, but I believe that we should say that it is. It's not just that Putin is saying that it's unfortunate that these countries have been artificially produced and don't have real legitimacy. It's also that in of itself just comes with the implication that Russia is entitled to a sphere of influence over these countries' fake sovereignty. So with a little bit, and indeed not much interpretation, we can say that 4 is definitely in the transcript. It's certainly in a 2008 transcript. It's probably in a 2001 transcript. But the question is, what weight does it have in Putin's head? Is it a priority number 1? Is it a priority number 77 to keep Ukraine in Russia's sphere? Let's get a little weaker. Reversibility logic intent. Putin believed Ukraine's westward drift must be reversible. So a temporary loss of influence over Ukraine may be acceptable as long as there isn't a permanent loss of influence over Ukraine. And here NATO expansion threatened to make that loss of influence over Ukraine irreversible. And 6, acceptance of Ukrainian independence intent. And that's obviously absent in all of the transcripts. That would be if Putin accepted Ukraine as a sovereign political actor and accepted that Ukraine's alliances were its own business. So NATO expansion is not a significant threat to Russian interests under this condition, or the NATO expansion into Ukraine, at least, is not a significant threat to Russian interests. So the viral discourse online has positioned the transcripts themselves as proving or implying 1, whereas in fact, they only imply something like 4. So where does the real truth lie beyond the transcripts? We'll talk about that in a moment, but let's just make a few points about the unfortunate nature of the framing that became popular. It doesn't allow for progression in Putin's thinking. Right? Why was it that Bush and Blair were saying we can deal with this guy, he looks all right? Is that because he was hiding what he really was? And if that's so, then that wouldn't be in the transcripts. Right? There's nothing in the transcripts that Bush and Blair wouldn't have heard from Putin because that's what he kept saying to them. But they were saying he wasn't a serious threat. Now, what kind of mistakes they were making about where this Putin story was going is a different question. But we've got to allow at least some space for evolution in Putin's thinking. And the unfortunate sort of viral posts which say that Putin wanted to invade Ukraine, or at least imply that Putin wanted to invade Ukraine from the beginning, lose this, right? They lose something that's very important to grasp, an account of how an individual enters power without any commitment to democracy at all, but then gets much more deeply corrupted by stay in informal and unchecked power. It gives the impression that Putin is interested in Ukraine as an end in itself. Too much, this kind of discourse that the transcripts generated. It's very important that Putin is obsessed with Ukraine, but that obsession is one of his many obsessions, and some obsessions have priority over other obsessions. And moreover, some obsessions are connected with other obsessions and are inseparable from them. And so what I'm saying here is that there is a pattern of escalation that Putin is committed to for various reasons. We'll come to those in a moment, in which Ukraine plays an instrumental role, right? Making a calamity in Ukraine is a way of getting at the West and destabilizing the West for Putin. Also, this talk centers imperial ambition over regime security. If this is a regime security war, the chances are that the decision to invade Ukraine must have been made more recently. If this is an imperial ambitions war, it's perhaps more plausible that the conscious intent to invade Ukraine was there earlier. So let's talk about this with a little bit of historical and analytical seriousness. So in the 90s, there is a demographic in Russia who we might call ideologues of return. And they believe that something very, very bad has happened, with many people and much territory ending outside of Russia's borders, ending up outside of Russia's borders when it should be inside. In the 90s, Putin's view about these people on the whole was that they were a bit nutty. It's rather the way he today thinks of Alexander Dugin. Alexander Dugin is a kind of a mentalist as far as Putin is concerned. So there's all kinds of convenient, eccentric things, and sometimes not very convenient things. And if there's too many not convenient things, you might follow Mr. Girkin. Mr. Girkin's fate of being incarcerated. Putin's first term is a strange term, and there is a video on the main channel about Putin's evolution across the terms from about 2 or 3 years ago. How Putin became a killer, or whatever it is that video is called. I think one of the weird things about Putin's first term is that he was practicing politics unnaturally. Yeltsin was no natural Democrat, but Putin was carrying on a lot of what happened under Yeltsin, whereas he really felt like he needed to change it. And we saw more of that in his second term. He wasn't fully himself then. But one important thing about Putin in that period, biographically, 2000 till 2004, is that Putin actually wasn't very interested in Ukraine. He was one of the people in the presidential administration who was least interested in Ukraine and was least interested in thinking about it. He was bored by the topic on the whole. Indeed, it's not only that the more hawkish people may have had thoughts about Ukraine that were more elaborate than Putin's. It's that the liberals, some of which were then excreted from institutions and became a street protest, but some of the liberals actually spent more time thinking about how to bring Ukraine and Belarus at least economically closer to Russia than Putin did. So the idea that Putin had the conscious intent to invade Ukraine in 2001 is crazy. It just shows you have no idea of the three-dimensionality of the history you're dealing with. I think in 2004, Putin stops being as bored by the question and begins thinking about it more. And the central thing to understand here is that Putin was, in a very paradoxical way, a pro-Western leader. He wasn't a pro-Western leader because he thought liberal democracy was good. In fact, he didn't think it was good or bad. He thought it was fake. He never believed in democracy. He never believed in relations of opposition. You're just enemies, pretending to be opponents, whereas you're just enemies deep down. But he was pro-Western in what I call a hyper-neoliberal sense. He thought money was power, and the West had money, and therefore it had power. And therefore, the West, good. Russia must be closer to the West. And between 2000 and 2008, Putin went through a process of traumatic disillusionment with the West. Much of this is inflected by various kinds of unhealthiness and resentments from Putin's childhood traumas and so on. He's somebody who can develop a traumatic relation to political issues very easily because of the baggage he brought into adult life. And so he developed a kind of trauma about the West. That the West was nothing like what he thought it was. And not only that, the West wasn't actually as powerful as he originally thought it was. And this was a product of seeing Western failure in Afghanistan and in Iraq. It was also a product of the 2008 financial crisis. Putin just, went from being triggered by the West being fake and sort of appallingly hypocritical in his view, which Iraq brought out. But it was also not as strong as he originally assumed, and it was in decline. And that was very, very significant. And it absolutely affected how Putin thought about Ukraine. So that's that very important block where Putin begins to be disenchanted with the West. Having never been enchanted with the West for the right reasons, if you like, but nevertheless, his disenchantment with the West plays out by 2008. 2010 till 2014 is the period when I began to think about Putin invading, even indeed a NATO country, like one of the Baltic states, or challenging Article 5 there. That's when Putin took a kind of missionary turn. This coincided with him being out of power and coming back to power and being very unimpressed with the way Mr. Medvedev conducted himself in office. And at this point, Putin went through a series of obsessions with Russian rulers of the past, in particular Alexander III, and about that we've also made a main channel video about 3 years ago. And so here things got a bit mystical and hyper-reactionary. And Putin began to think about various ways of propelling Russia from the back row to the front row of nations. And that was not so much about national security as it was about a certain vision of Russian historical resurrection. Then there was the period 2014 till 2020, when Putin improvised a partial invasion of Ukraine and became indeed very emotional about Eastern Ukraine and the Donbass. And one of the paradoxes there is that Putin has an obsession with the notion that a genocide, the G word, occurred in East Ukraine. And what's interesting is that official sources from the LNR and DNR that the Kremlin would be relying on demonstrate that that's not the case. I mean, we're talking about civilians killed from sort of bombardments in 2021, 2020. We're talking about numbers being in the single digits, in the very low double digits, 5, 10 per year. So evidence on which Putin himself relies says that there's nothing like the G word, but he became obsessed with the G word event there. And it became a kind of neurotic sort of hole for him into which he got pulled. and it very much got to him emotionally. That's important. So we're certainly now getting into a period where there was significant sort of emotional activation about East Ukraine, certainly. 2020, something very significant happened. Putin went into isolation and spent a lot of time with one of the Kovalchuk brothers, who almost certainly had some kind of, if not instigating, then certainly sort of reconfirming influence on Putin around something like the notion of full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So we don't know when the thought that he's going to do it became consolidated in his mind, that he's going to do a full-scale invasion. But let's say that it was sometime between 2020 and 2022. So 2020 or 2021 is the most plausible guess we have. Not 2004, not even 2014. It's very important when we think about the causes of war that we understand that the central cause of war is not NATO expansion, but regime security. That's to say, Putin is concerned that an independent Ukraine might constitute a threat to his power. That's one element of the regime security motivation. Another element of the regime security motivation is that Putin felt he needed to grasp back some of the power he was outsourcing to his elites, and the only way to do that was through war. And it's a debate in the expert community whether Putin needs escalation or war. Whether escalation will do, whether he actually needs war for his regime security. So this is, in the first instance, a regime security war. It's a war Putin needs to do, even if a guarantee descends to him from heavens that Ukraine will never be a member of NATO. Indeed, even if a guarantee descends to him from heavens that NATO will cease to exist, he might well still need to do this war. So this is a primarily regime security war. And here we have an almost total convergence of the expert community on this point. But in public discourse, there is still a debate about whether this is a regime security war or a national security war. And it has to be a national security war for NATO expansion to be a central cause of it. The second kind of category of reason for the war is what I call mystical imperialism. And I don't want to categorize that as national security reflection, national security calculation. This is about various kinds of visions about Russia realizing its historical destiny, which is now to a degree at one with the biographical destiny of Vladimir Putin. Now, the third reasons for war are indeed regime security. And here you could have conversations about various topics, including NATO and NATO expansion. So let me give you a quick framing of this from a video that speaks quite a bit to what we're discussing now on the main channel called How Putin Fooled the Western Left. And there I make the case against the Jeffrey Sachs and Noam Chomsky and sort of Glenn Greenwald position on what's actually happening. So let's do this absurd activity of watching one of the channels on the other channel. And I've got to label what this is because I actually know somebody who got a copyright strike for posting his content from his main channel on his second channel. NATO expansion was handled badly, and Western leaders like Bill Clinton knew that when they were doing it. Before we tackle this, let's clarify the infamous "not 1 inch to the east" promise. Was there a promise? Promises were made repeatedly, but they weren't formalized. So here is my analysis. A politician can promise another politician something by saying it, but a state cannot promise another state something without formalizing it on paper. And when we look at the formality, we see that the Kremlin signed a treaty explicitly allowing the expansion of Article 5 eastward. When Putin says that Russia got fooled, he is half right. Mr. Gorbachev got fooled because he was an extraordinary leader and a poor negotiator. But the Soviet Union, being a state, didn't get fooled because states don't make promises to each other that aren't on paper. And what then followed was that the East European countries wanted to run away from Moscow and join their own security alliance. Because when Russia invaded Ukraine and nearly took Kiev in 2022, this wasn't the first time. There was Budapest in 56, there's Prague in 68, and there is Poland in 81, when there weren't Russian tanks in Warsaw, but there were Polish tanks ordered from Moscow. But as Mary Surratt argues in her path-breaking book, the problem wasn't that NATO expanded, the problem was how NATO expanded. For example, there was a possibility of a more rapid but more diffuse expansion, which is what Clinton wanted, partly because it would avoid creating a line by leaving Ukraine on the wrong end of it. Either way, as Mary Surratt argues, nothing was more conducive to radicalizing Russia than expanding NATO in small tranches. But while this radicalized Russia, NATO expansion is not a primary cause of war. Centering it doesn't account for the domestic regime security causes of war. And as we have seen, reducing Putin's sense of mission to grievances about NATO expansion over-instrumentalizes his worldview. So, it's very important that you don't benefit from overstating your case when you already have a strong case. Now, while the expert community on Russia tends to think that NATO expansion wasn't the central cause of war, there is public debate out there, admittedly. And there are many prominent figures, many of them with academic credentials, argue that NATO expansion was the central cause of war. Now, you've followed me for many years on this channel and on the main channel, and you know that my position is to strongly recommend against the idea that NATO expansion is a central cause of war. Because it's a regime security war with a very big inflection of mystical escalation, and national security considerations of whatever kind, for me, come third when we think about causes of war. But what you don't need to do is jump to the conclusion that national security has no part at all to play in the causes of war. Because here, what you'll be doing is depriving yourself of the truthful complexity of historical narratives. You'll be depriving yourself of being taken seriously by people who want to understand the nuance. And you will be acting really as a sort of functionary of the commercial needs of the big companies who run algorithms which incline you to simplify and indeed commodify the positions you hold, right? Because what does the algorithmic bubble in which we find ourselves here invite us to do? Invite us to say, excuse me, somebody on my street has just said that NATO expansion was not a central cause of the invasion. I'm going to go and knock on their door and correct them. So here I go. Knock, knock, knock. Hi, you know how you said that the NATO thing, it's not the main thing because this is just, they're doing this terrible, they're just terrible in there, and they're just doing this escalation, it's all very mean, and they've invaded and provoked, and it's a regime security war because Putin wants power, but it's also got this mystical mentalism, blah, blah, blah. But you said it wasn't one of the central causes of war. Well, I need to correct you. It actually wasn't part of the causes of war at all. So actually, NATO and the way we expanded NATO, Had nothing to do with it. I just wanted to say that because it's really good. It's it's what Elon Musk wants me to say. Not personally, but that's what his algorithm wants you to say. And yes, pro-Ukrainian voices have been demoted on Twitter, but there's still enormous incentive within the pro-Ukrainian bubble to make this correction. Don't do it. Don't become victims of a consumerist enterprise, right? That wants to flatten out your thinking, because you want to leave yourself space, right, for thinking how, for instance, we could have done NATO expansion better. This is what Mary Surratt argues. You also don't need to land in the conclusion that NATO expansion wouldn't have been any kind of a threat to Russia at all had Russia been, in virtue of some magical turn, a liberal democratic country run by Bernie Sanders. What you need to establish, the only thing you need to establish, and you can clearly establish, is that NATO expansion was not an existential threat to Russia, unless you conceive of Russia as an expansive imperial project. That's enough. That does it for you, right? That knocks out John Mearsheimer. You don't need to say it's got, there's nothing at all to be talked about when it comes to the national security dimension of the causes of war. You don't need to bring that to zero, right? If it's at 10%, that's fine. You got it, right? Don't bring it to zero just because you're inclined to, algorithmically or via the coercion of the informal constraints of public opinion. So why shouldn't we slightly overstate our case if we're right about something? Apart from the fact that we want to be truthful, the other political reason is that it's terribly polarizing, right? Because once you begin behaving even a little bit as though any argument is good as long as it's against the other side, you compartmentalize yourself into mental world and fact bubbles, and thereby achieve the Putinist aim of undermining your own democracy by increasing the degree to which citizens within it are incapable of speaking to one another. I don't know if this was helpful, but if you've survived it, thank you for being with me, and we'll probably be together tomorrow again. So lots of love and catch you soon.